The message board on the south side of Atigun Pass is flashing the same warning for the third time this week. Pass closed. Avalanche control in progress. A driver named in this story only as a Carlisle owner-operator sits idling at mile 241 of the Dalton Highway, watching snow move sideways across his windshield in sheets, and doing math that has nothing to do with distance. He is not calculating how far he has left to drive. He is calculating how many hours he has left to legally drive at all, how much fuel is burning while he waits, and whether this is storm number 3 or the tail end of storm number 2. 3 days earlier, this same stretch of road was clear. Now it has been hit, recovered, and hit again. Twice. And there is a third system already stacking up over the Brooks Range. Most people assume a blizzard is one event. It arrives, it rages, it passes, and life resumes. That is true almost everywhere in the world. It is not true on the Dalton Highway in the dead of an Alaska winter, where the storm track running up through the Gulf of Alaska can fire off system after system in the same week, each one separated by a window of clear, bitterly cold air, just long enough to convince a driver the worst is over before the next one rolls in. This is the story of what happens when truck drivers are not surviving a single storm, but 3 of them, back to back, with barely enough time between each one to dig out, refuel, and decide whether to push or wait again. If you are watching this on your television tonight, thank you for being here. Most of the audience for this channel watches exactly the way you are right now, on the big screen rather than a phone. And that matters more than you might think for a channel like this one. If this story earns a little of your time, subscribing costs nothing, and sharing it with one other person costs even less. And both genuinely help a small channel like this keep telling stories about the people who keep America's hardest roads moving. Now, back to the pass. The Dalton Highway runs 414 miles from just north of Fairbanks to Deadhorse on the shore of the Arctic Ocean. Built originally to supply the Trans-Alaska Pipeline and still serving the oil fields at Prudhoe Bay today. Along the way, it climbs the Brooks Range at Atigun Pass, a notch in the mountain sitting at roughly 4,739 feet. The only place where the highway crosses the Continental Divide, and the single most unpredictable stretch of road in the entire system. Alaska's Department of Transportation keeps message boards on both sides of the pass specifically because conditions there change faster than any forecast can keep up with. And avalanche activity is common enough that the state lists it as a routine hazard, not an exception. Drivers have been stranded there for days at a time, not because their trucks failed, but because the mountain itself decided the road was closed. Here is what most people never realize about a multi-storm week. The first storm is rarely the dangerous one. Drivers prepare for the first storm. They check their bunk heaters. They verify their fuel treatment. They top off at the Yukon River Bridge or at Coldfoot, the tiny community at mile 175 that exists almost entirely to serve the highway. Population somewhere around 34 people in the official count. The first storm gets respect. It is the second and third storms in the same week that catch experienced drivers off guard, because by then fatigue has already accumulated, fuel reserves have already been spent, and the truck itself has already been pushed through one full cycle of extreme cold without a real chance to fully recover. Picture the sequence the way a driver actually experiences it. Storm 1 arrives over the coastal plain near Deadhorse and rolls south into the foothills, dropping visibility to nothing and burying the road in wind-packed drifts that grade scrapers cannot keep ahead of. The driver pulls into a turnout or behind a string of other trucks, runs the auxiliary power unit to keep the cab warm without idling the main engine, and waits it out. Maybe 6 hours, maybe 14. When it breaks, the plows move through, the pass reopens, and the convoy starts moving again. Slowly, each truck keeping enormous following distance because the road surface underneath the fresh snow is often packed ice that nobody can see. That is the part of the story most people would expect. Here is the part nobody talks about. The gap between Storm 1 and Storm 2 is not really a recovery period. It is a sprint. Drivers use that window to make up lost hours of service. Because federal hours of service regulations only allow 11 hours of driving within a 14-hour duty window, and a driver who burned 10 of those hours sitting still during a closure has almost none left to actually cover ground once the road reopens. There is a regulation built specifically for this situation. Under Federal Rule 395, 1B, a driver who encounters adverse conditions that were not known or reasonably foreseeable before the trip began can extend both the driving limit and the duty window by up to 2 additional hours, but only if the delay genuinely could not have been anticipated, and only if it is logged correctly on the electronic logging device at the time. It sounds like a small detail. On a week with 3 separate storms, it becomes the difference between reaching Coldfoot safely and being forced to shut down on the open road as the next system arrives, because the clock that governs how long a driver can legally keep moving does not pause just because the weather got worse. This is where the second storm becomes more dangerous than the first. A driver racing a depleted hours of service clock through a brief clear window is now making decisions under time pressure that did not exist 48 hours earlier. Experienced operators on this corridor know the names truckers have given to the worst stretches for a reason. Beaver Slide, Oil Spill Hill. The spot drivers simply call Oh Shit Corner. These names exist because generations of drivers needed shorthand for places where a small mistake in good conditions becomes a serious one in bad conditions. And during a second storm arriving on the heels of the first, every one of those landmarks is exactly where attention has to be sharpest, right when a driver's body is least equipped to provide it. Sleep is the hidden casualty of a multi-storm week, and it rarely gets discussed because it does not look like a crisis from the outside. A driver parked during a closure is not resting the way a night in a real bed would allow. The sleeper berth on a long-haul truck is built for recovery during normal operations, insulated and heated well enough to handle -40-degree air with the main engine off, running instead on a diesel-fired bunk heater or an auxiliary power unit designed for exactly this purpose. But sleep inside a stationary truck during an active storm is shallow and fragmented. Wind buffets the trailer hard enough to rock the whole rig. Drivers wake repeatedly to check the auxiliary power unit gauges, to clear exhaust vents that can ice over and create a carbon monoxide risk if left unchecked, and to glance at the CB radio traffic. Because on a road with no cell service for most of its length, the CB is often the only way to learn that the pass ahead has reopened, or that a truck 2 miles up the line has slid off the shoulder. Most people would assume the obvious answer to all of this is simple. If 3 storms are coming in 1 week, why not just wait it out at a yard in Fairbanks and let the week pass? The honest answer is that the cargo moving north on the Dalton Highway in winter is rarely the kind of freight that tolerates a week's delay. Oilfield operations at Prudhoe Bay run on tight maintenance schedules, and the parts moving north on these trucks, drill components, generator parts, critical spares for equipment that cannot simply be shut down in the Arctic winter, are often needed by a specific date, not a flexible one. A truck sitting in Fairbanks for a week is not just a truck sitting idle. It is a piece of equipment somewhere on the north slope that stays broken a week longer, at a cost measured in far more than fuel. That obligation, more than any kind of bravado, is what keeps drivers pushing into a second and third storm instead of simply waiting in Fairbanks for spring. There is also a financial reality behind every hour spent parked at a turnout that rarely makes it into outside conversations about trucking. Detention time, the hours a driver loses sitting still waiting out a closure, is not always compensated the same way driving time is, and policies vary significantly between carriers. Some companies build weather delay paid directly into their contracts for this exact corridor, recognizing that a driver stuck at Atigun Pass for 14 hours is still working in every meaningful sense, monitoring the truck, managing the cargo, staying alert for a window to move. Others leave that gap uncovered, which means a 3-storm week can cost an owner-operator real income even though they never stopped being responsible for the truck and the load. Experienced Dalton Highway drivers know exactly which carriers handle this fairly, and it factors into who they choose to drive for almost as much as the pay rate itself. By the time Storm 2 breaks and the brief window before Storm 3 opens up, most drivers on this corridor are running on accumulated sleep debt that would be unacceptable in almost any other profession, and they are aware of it. This is not recklessness. It is the nature of a closed system. There is no hotel to retreat to. Wiseman, the next community past Coldfoot, has a population of about a dozen people and no truck stop infrastructure to speak of. Fuel exists at exactly 3 points along the entire 400-mile corridor: the Yukon River Bridge, Coldfoot, and Deadhorse itself, which means a driver cannot simply choose to wait somewhere more comfortable. The truck is the shelter. The truck is the rest stop. The truck is, in every practical sense, the only safe place that exists between one storm and the next. What separates the drivers who make it through a week like this from the ones who get into real trouble is not toughness in the way people usually picture it. It is judgment, repeated under pressure, dozens of times in a row, without the benefit of a full night's sleep to reset between decisions. Carlisle Transportation, Linden Transport, and Alaska West Express, the major carriers that run this corridor, all build their training around exactly this scenario, because a driver who treats the third storm in a week the same way they treated the first one, with the same caution and the same willingness to simply stop, is the driver who arrives in Deadhorse a day late instead of not arriving at all. The instinct that keeps a trucker alive on a corridor like this is the willingness to lose time on purpose, again and again, even when every part of the schedule, the fatigue, and the hours of service clock is pushing in the opposite direction. There is a particular moment that drivers who have worked this corridor for years describe almost identically, and it usually happens during the third storm of a sequence like this one, not the first. It is the moment a driver, parked at a turnout with the auxiliary power unit humming and wind-rocking the trailer, realizes that the fatigue they are feeling is not ordinary tiredness anymore. It is cumulative. It is the kind of fatigue that comes from 3 partial nights stacked on top of each other, each one interrupted by ice, by gauges, by CB chatter, by the simple ongoing tension of not knowing exactly when the next door of clear weather will open. Veteran drivers describe handling this moment the same way every time. They stop making decisions entirely for a few hours. No checking the radio every 20 minutes. No recalculating the hours of service math. No rehearsing the next push. Just rest. Real rest, even if it is short. Because at that level of fatigue, the most dangerous thing a driver can do is keep thinking they can push through one more closure on willpower alone. The third storm, when it finally arrives, is rarely the strongest of the 3 in terms of raw wind speed or snowfall. What makes it the one drivers remember is that it lands on a body and a truck that have already been worked hard twice. Diesel fuel gelling becomes a real risk by this point. If fuel treatment was not aggressive enough the first time around, because cold this extreme, with sustained stretches well below -40, and wind chill capable of pushing past -60 across the passes, attacks the weakest link in any system. And after 2 storms, the weakest link is usually whatever got slightly neglected the first time through. A fuel additive added a little late, a battery that did not get a full charge during the last stop, a door seal that let in just enough cold air to make the bunk heater work harder than it should have to. Most outsiders assume diesel is just diesel, but on a corridor like this, the blend in the tank is its own form of insurance. Fuel sold along the Dalton Highway in winter is typically a heavier treated winter blend than what the same truck might run on a southern interstate, formulated specifically to resist the wax crystals that form in standard diesel once temperatures drop far enough. A driver who tops off with the wrong assumptions about that blend, or who skips a second dose of anti-gel treatment after the first storm because the truck made it through fine the first time, is setting up exactly the kind of failure that tends to show up hours into the third closure, not the first one. When there is no warm shop anywhere within reach to thaw a fuel line. This is also the point in a sequence like this where the trucking community on the Dalton Highway functions less like individual operators and more like a single coordinated unit, even without anyone officially organizing it. Drivers parked at the same turnout during a third closure check on each other over the CB, not out of formality, but because everyone on that stretch of road understands they are the only help available to each other until the state's own equipment can get through. A driver low on fuel after 2 storms might end up borrowing diesel treatment from someone parked nearby. A driver whose APU starts acting unreliable in the cold might get a hand from another trucker who has seen the same failure before and knows the fix. None of this is written into any company policy. It exists because the corridor demands it, and because everyone parked on that mountain in a third consecutive storm knows exactly what the others are going through, because they are going through it too. When the third storm finally breaks and the message boards on either side of Atigun Pass switch from closed to open, there is no celebration in the way you might expect. Drivers do not throw open their doors and cheer. They run through the same checklist they ran after Storm 1 and Storm 2. Fuel lines, tire condition, hours of service math, before easing back onto a road that is still packed with refrozen snow and shadowed by a mountain that has spent the last week proving it does not care how many systems it takes to make a point. The relief, when it comes, is quiet. It is the kind of relief that looks, from the outside, exactly like exhaustion. Because by the time the corridor is finally clear for real, exhaustion and relief are running through a driver's body at almost the same time. What this week ultimately reveals is something most people never think about when they picture a trucking job. The challenge of extreme weather on a corridor like the Dalton Highway is not really about surviving one dramatic event. Dramatic events are what outsiders imagine. The single epic blizzard, the one harrowing night. The real test is administrative and physical at the same time. A grinding sequence of small decisions, repeated under worsening fatigue, where the job is not to be a hero during one crisis, but to remain disciplined and clear-headed through 3 of them in a row. Each one slightly harder than the last because the body underneath the gear has less in reserve every single time. The next time you see a truck rolling through bad weather, even somewhere far less extreme than the Brooks Range, it is worth remembering that the storm you are watching might not be the first one that driver has faced that week, and it almost certainly will not be the last one this winter. There is a quieter dimension to a week like this that has nothing to do with fuel or hours of service, and it tends to surface during the long, silent stretches between storms rather than during the storms themselves. With no cell coverage for most of the corridor, the only way most drivers stay connected to anyone outside the truck is through satellite messaging devices or brief check-in calls placed from one of the 3 fuel points along the route. A driver who has been parked through 2 closures and is bracing for a third often spends those rare minutes of connectivity not describing the storm at all, but asking about something entirely ordinary back home, a kid's school project, a spouse's day, anything that has nothing to do with snow or wind chill. Veteran drivers describe this as a kind of anchor, a reminder that the version of their life happening hundreds of miles south is still going on normally while they sit on a mountain waiting for a message board to change from red to green. It is a small thing, and it rarely makes it into how outsiders picture this job, but it is often what gets a driver through the third storm with the same level of patience they had for the first one. The work does not stop because the weather got worse. The work exists because someone has to keep moving when the weather gets worse, 3 times in a row if that is what the season demands, so that the rest of the world barely notices the gap on the shelf where the supplies that truck was carrying would have gone. And cold is only 1/2 of what this profession has to survive. The same drivers who know how to wait out a 3rd consecutive blizzard in the Brooks Range are, in a different season entirely, learning a completely different set of instincts, because somewhere south of the Arctic, a different kind of emergency moves far faster than any storm ever could and gives a truck driver far less warning before it arrives. That is a story for what happens when the road itself starts to burn.